Hello, my dear friends. This lecture is actually not one that I have written, but it's simply an article written by Woodhouse, Professor Emeritus. You can find it in the Philosophical Inquiry in Education Journal, volume number 27. This article was written in the year 2020 CE, and this selection comes from pages 135 to 152. The article is titled, Russell and Chomsky as Advocates of Humanistic Education. And so we will go over certain philosophers later on, not in particular Chomsky, but probably Bertrand Russell. Because Bertrand Russell was one of the greatest thinkers of the 20th century. This article shows how Bertrand Russell and Noam Chomsky's approaches to humanistic education are grounded in the concepts of growth, knowledge, language, freedom, and social justice. Despite their epistemological differences, Russell and Chomsky agree on the need for educating the public to abuses of power. Their own practice of education is a source of inspiration for intellectuals who wish to counter the current discourse in schools and universities by upholding the value of academic freedom. The influence of Bertrand Russell, who lived from 1872 to 1970, and Noam Chomsky, born in 1928, who is still now living with us, on the disciplines and practices of philosophy, mathematical logic, linguistics, and social and political theory, has been considerable. Their lives, which span almost 150 years, from the Victorian age of history to the present day, have been rich sources of discussion not only in academia, but as examples of public intellectuals' engagement in practical affairs. Yet their contributions to education and its philosophical underpinnings are perhaps less well known than their opposition to war and the struggle for peace and social justice. This article shows how both philosophers contribute to an understanding of humanistic education, enabling the creative impulse for growth. Russell, in 1926, for example, expresses the hope that a generation of children, quote, educated in fearless freedom, end quote, could build a better world, whereas Chomsky in 1987 believes schools should be places where, quote, children were encouraged to pursue their interests and avoid intense competitiveness and regimentation, end quote. Since the current trends in educational discourse have moved in precisely the opposite direction, an examination of Russell and Chomsky's accounts, far from being arcane, can serve as a counterbalance to the constructive ideology that is now dominant in schools and universities. In order to make this argument, I begin by explaining the meaning of humanism and its relation to education, and go on to analyze Russell and Chomsky's organic conception of education. Having discussed contrasts and similarities between their work, I then examine their different epistemological frameworks. I consider how both philosophers have been involved in educational practice, and then connect their work with other philosophers in the humanist tradition, and its relevance to schools and universities today. In conclusion, Russell and Chomsky agree that academic freedom is central to the work of all intellectuals who speak truth to power. Humanism and education. The tradition of humanism in the Western world has its root in the Enlightenment. As Carrington in 2014 points out, a variety of thinkers critical of the scholastic tradition of transmitting speculative theology to passive students proposed an alternative account concerned with, quote, studies of human beings living well in the world, end quote. Humanism brought a fresh approach to education in which the personal relationship between teacher and student became its primary focus. The goal of education included the acquisition of knowledge, but the emphasis was now upon enabling students to learn in ways that enhance their own capacities for life in the family and in the community. To this extent, a humanistic approach is consistent with the true meaning of education, which, as its Latin root suggests, is to cause to grow. Here he quotes McMurtry in 1988 and Rebrule in 1992. Cobson in 2015 provides an account of the dynamic history of humanism and shows that by the dawn of the 19th century, the word humanist denoted not just a student of the humanities, especially the culture of the ancient European world, but a holder of the view that this curriculum was best guaranteed to develop the human being personally, intellectually, culturally, and socially. Although the meaning of humanism evolved, it was consistent with the idea that education should enable the capacities of the human being as a whole rather than focus exclusively on their intellectual development. The complexities of humanistic education are underlined by White, 2015, who argues that despite its apparent emancipation from religious beliefs, it shares some of the same presuppositions. Most humanists in present-day Britain and similar countries have an antipathy towards indoctrination because of their belief in people being critical thinkers and making up their own minds on controversial issues. Many, perhaps most religious believers in our society, also share their liberalism. But in opposition to indoctrination and a belief in critical thought are aims that Russell and Chomsky believe are vital to their secularized conceptions of humanistic education. The concept of organic growth is central to Rousseau's educational thought, according to which early childhood is best served by a negative education that consists not in teaching virtue or truth, but in preserving the heart from vice and from the spirit of error. Russell is critical of Rousseau's negative theory of education, which, quote, while it has many important elements of truth and is largely valid so far as the emotions are concerned, cannot be accepted in its entirety as regards intellectual and technical training, end quote. Robison, in 2015, agrees and considers negative education as, quote, less about communicating truth and facts to children and more about safeguarding an opening of learning of a learning environment, end quote. Barrow, in 1878, finds Rousseau's concept of nature ambiguous, while Barrow and Woods question Rousseau's claim, quote, that children cannot be ready to read literature until the age of 15, since children can read and understand literature before that age. Martin, 1981, objects to Rousseau's using the guise of the dictates of nature to educate Sophie to be a subservient to Emile. Oelkers, in 2014, believes that, quote, Rousseau is read because he defines the problems of education, not because he provides the solutions, end quote. Russell and Chomsky's humanistic conceptions of education. Chomsky, in 2000, agrees with Russell that the humanistic conception of education, the idea that education is not to be viewed as something like filling a vessel with water, but rather assisting a flower to grow in its own way, providing the circumstances in which the normal creative patterns will flourish. And as we shall see, Russell adopts this same metaphor of providing the right kind of soil in which the young plant can grow as illustrative of the pedagogical relationship. In doing so, he conceives of education as an organic process that enables the child's innate patterns of growth to flourish. By rejecting the view that education is a matter of filling empty vessels with information, both he and Chomsky paved the way to a critique of the mechanistic practice of standardized testing, which will be examined towards the end of this article. And so we think of kindergarten, Kinder meaning child, and Garten meaning garden in German. Kindergarten means child garden, and as this metaphor suggests, we see children as a flower who we need to help facilitate their growth. And so Russell in 1916 re-emphasized the organic basis of humanistic education in the following terms. Quote, the impulses of men and women, insofar as they are of real importance in their lives, are not detached from one another, but proceed from a central principle of growth, an instinctive urgency leading them in a certain direction, as trees seek the light. The utmost that social institutions can do for man is to make his own growth free and vigorous. They cannot force him to grow according to the pattern of others. In defining the principle of growth as the unifying source of both preconscious impulses and conscious desires, Russell compares human development to the natural growth of organisms, thereby acknowledging that humans are biological beings. At the same time, Russell recognizes that, quote, this intimate center in each human being differs from man to man, and determines for each man the type of excellence of which he is capable, end quote. As a result, social institutions like education should aim for the liberation of the child's potential for growth, rather than the inculcation of fixed and determinate patterns of development. And he is clear that the task applies equally to physical and intellectual education, For, quote, there is in human beings, as in plants and animals, a certain impulse of growth, and this is just as true of mental as well as physical development, end quote. And, of course, we see the mention of standardized testing, which is, in a similar sense, just as important, but in a sense it is a form of child abuse, a light form of child abuse, in my opinion. But in order to grow in constructive ways, the child needs to acquire a self-discipline that gives them a sense of purpose, since externally imposed discipline deadens growth and the spirit of inquiry. This is from Woodhouse in 1992, the writer of this article. The channeling of children's impulses in constructive directions depends very much on the environment in which they are educated. Russell in 1916 emphasizes that expressions of the principle of growth can be restricted by such environmental factors as, quote, beliefs, material circumstances, social circumstances, and institutions, end quote. As long as social institutions do not, quote, outlast the circumstances which made them a fit garment for instinct, end quote, they can enhance children's freedom. At the same time, he does not regard this as a matter of allowing an unstructured tabula rasa to thrash about in a random manner to achieve autonomy. Rather, his conception of freedom is based upon the view of individuals as forging their nature in ways that further their own paths of development. Only within the context of a unifying principle of growth, at the core of instinctive impulses, can this process take place successfully. Unfortunately, those institutions inherited from the past that tend to block creative impulses, force them into destructive channels, and crush growth are, quote, the state, private property, the patriarchal family, the churches, armies, and navies. All of these have become in some degree oppressive and in some measure hostile to life, end quote. For Russell, the goal of education is to educate children in ways that challenge these life-blind institutions founded on hatred and fear. As necessary as they are, a vision of education capable of freeing children from these stifling emotions requires Russell in 1916 to introduce what he calls the, quote, principle of reverence, end quote. Since some form of the adult authority is unavoidable in education, there is need for adults to treat children with particular care. Quote, in the presence of the child, the adult feels an unaccountable humility, a humility not easily defended on any rational ground, and yet somehow nearer to wisdom than the easy self-confidence of many parents and teachers, end quote. Reverence implies a deep respect on the part of the teacher and or adult for the principle of growth at the core of each child's life. Reverence for the child builds a loving relationship between the adult and teacher and the young individual. Reverence also enhances the scope of liberty, an essentially negative principle which, quote, tells us not to interfere, but it does not give any basis for construction, end quote, especially in the educational sphere. In contrast, reverence implies more than just a simple non-interference on the part of adults, an act of caring for the well-being and freedom of the young so that they themselves can actively channel their impulses in creative ways. Here we want to mention interventionist approaches, non-interventionist approaches, integrationalist approaches. This goes into how much control the teacher has, whether the teacher has the most control in the classroom, or whether the students have the most control in the classroom, or whether the educator works in and with the children and shares the control in the classroom with the students. And much has been written on that. And so this process, which, quote, is subtle and complex, can only be felt by a delicate intuition and dimly apprehended by imagination and respect, end quote. Requires an intuitive understanding that reaches out to each child in ways that strengthen their emotional growth. An education based upon the principle of reverence also, quote, provides encouragement for opportunities for exercising mental faculties, end quote, enhancing their intellectual growth, a goal which Russell considers especially important, as we shall see. The harmonious development of these twin aspects of children's patterns of growth enables them to become subjects capable of determining how best to lead their own lives without the interference of, quote, any kind of force, whether discipline or authority or fear or the tyranny of public opinion, end quote. Chomsky in 1971 acknowledges his debt to Russell in lectures delivered at the University of Cambridge after the philosopher's death, published as Problems of Knowledge and Freedom. The source of their agreement lies in their shared belief in the humanistic conception of man. End quote. Chomsky believes the knowledge and freedom comprising the basis of education are a function of innate principles of mental organization that place limits upon what can be known. Freedom and creativity have meaning only in relation to biological principles that form the eternal core of human beings. Quote, Chomsky says, the principles of mind provide the scope as well as the limits of human creativity. Without such principles, scientific understanding and creative acts would not be possible. End quote. Innate structures of the human mind enable both scientific understanding and the artistic creation by placing limits upon their creative expression. Elsewhere, Chomsky, 1975, argues that neither activity would be possible without these, quote, conditions and constraints, end quote, since otherwise, quote, someone who is throwing paints at a wall in an arbitrary fashion is not acting creatively as an artist, end quote. Similarly, a scientist who systematically ignores the established rules of the experimental method would, by acting in an arbitrary fashion, be transgressing the bounds of their discipline. For Chomsky, then, quote, some system of constraints and forms and principles and rules is presupposed as a basis for any kind of creative action, end quote. It is Chomsky's study of language and in linguistics that provides the conceptual framework for the freedom and creativity at the core of his humanistic approach to education. Chomsky, in 2006, believes that, quote, creativity is an aspect of the ordinary and daily use of language and human action in general, end quote. This creativity is shown by most young children who are able to learn their first language despite the complexity of its syntax and phonology. Traditional theories emphasizing metamorphological knowledge as fundamental prove inadequate in their attempts to explain language learning. Rather, according to Olson in 2016, the process involves, quote, a conceptual shift which is required to shift attention from meaning to the underlying form that expresses that meaning, end quote. This underlying form is provided by the syntactic structures of the human mind, not the paucity of stimuli provided by the environment. If behaviorism were correct and environmental factors were the only ones involved, it would remain a mystery how the child would learn so much from so little external stimulation, Chomsky says in 1980. Chomsky says in 1987 that the ongoing attempt to explain how the operations and development of human language are made by possible by, quote, a system of generative processes rooted in innate properties of mind, but permitting an infinite use of finite means, end quote, is intimately related to his view of education. Only where the inherent capacity of children for language learning is presupposed as an open-ended organic potentiality capable of generating new and creative sentences can an adequate theory of education begin to take shape. Indeed, when writing of the relationship between language and freedom, Chomsky argues that, quote, there are, I think, few footholds that seem fairly firm. I like to believe that the intensive study of one aspect of human psychology, human language, may contribute to a humanistic social science that will serve as well as an instrument for social action. In other words, his hope is that the discipline of linguistics, which pays full attention to the psychology of a creative human nature, is capable of spawning a humanistic social science consistent with liberating social practice. While this speculative claim includes psychology and the other social sciences, the practice of education is consistent with the kind of social action which Chomsky believes would benefit from insights that afford systematic ways of interpreting and changing the world. Russell's colleague, Alfred N. Whitehead, which he worked with in 1929 and 1957, also believes that the child is, quote, a living organism which grows by its own impulse to self-development. For all your stimulation and guidance, the creative impulse comes from within and is intensely characteristic of the individual, end quote. For an analysis of Whitehead's educational philosophy, see Woodhouse's publication in 2014. For a recent analysis of the ways in which corporate capitalism is life-blind, see McMurtry in 2012, quote, in which he says, at the doctrinal level, economic thought is in principle incapable of recognizing what has gone wrong. In the dominant neoclassical doctrine, a life-blind value system is built in, end quote. Russell's principle of reverence can be compared to that of Nottings's and publications in 1984 and 2003. conception of caring, a conception of a caring relationship whose logic implies not only that the adult care for the child, but that the child reciprocates with a feeling of open, receptive attention, which she refers to as engrossment. Noddings, in 2005, however, parts company with Russell when she proposes that the reorganization of schools around themes of care in the place of a curriculum founded on a liberal education. Berlin, 1967, makes a distinction between positive and negative freedom, decrying the former as potentially oppressive. However, Bay, in 1958, argued for a strong conception of freedom that included both aspects, while Woodhouse, in 1992, analyzes the relationship between freedom and Russell's principle of reverence. Chomsky's emphasis on freedom in 2006 is framed within the context of an anarcho-syndicalism, whose goal is, quote, a system of decentralized power and free association that can serve to maximize decent human instincts, end quote. Russell in 1985 also sees the potential of syndicalism to effect, quote, a fundamental reconstruction, a sweeping sway of all the sources of oppression, a liberation of men's constructive energies, end quote. Hacker in 2013 takes issue, though, with Chomsky's account of language learning, stating that, quote, the problems ramify widely, reaching deep into questions in philosophy of language. It should be evident that mistaken answers to questions on one orbit affect the whole world model, distorting the metal bands and jamming the cogs. Then we go into a section on contrast and agreements. Despite the agreement by both philosophers about the value of a humanistic conception of education, there is at least one significant difference in their approach. On the one hand, Russell in 1916 proposes the principle of growth as, quote, an instinctive urgency, unifying the impulses and desires of men and women so that they can engage in free and constructive and creative activity. While, on the other hand, Chomsky in 1975 considers the, quote, system of constraints and forms and principles and rules, end quote, that compromise the organizational structures of the mind to be the source of freedom. Whereas Russell is concerned with educating children in ways that liberate their emotional lives in constructive ways, Chomsky, in 2006, is more concerned with understanding the processes that generate the creativity of human language. One proposes an educational philosophy that recognizes the need for children to experience the full expression of their emotions in the learning process. The other conceives of linguistics as the major discipline for understanding how human beings acquire language through an interplay of the universal principles of mind and the learning environment. Nevertheless, Russell's emphasis upon children's emotional growth does not preclude him from recognizing the importance of intellectual education. And here there is some agreement with Chomsky. Russell finds that state-run schools too often deny the freedom necessary for the natural curiosity of children to flourish, thereby stunting their intellectual growth. They do this by a process of indoctrination, which involves not only passing on false beliefs, but, quote, the conviction that some particular creed is the truth, end quote. The kind of extreme nationalism that led to the First World War and the willingness with which the citizens of all sides embraced the conflict was the source of Russell's opposition to the indoctrination propagated by state-run schools. These dangers can be avoided where teachers provide an environment in which children become open-minded and adopt beliefs in proportion to the available evidence and be willing to revise them when there's sufficient counter-evidence. This is from Hare, 1995. Russell in 1950 believed that a pedagogy based on a scientific frame of mind gives rise to beliefs that are held tentatively instead of being held dogmatically, which is consistent with the fact that science is empirical, tentative, and undogmatic. The scientific outlook then, in Russell, then provides the key to an education in which children become enlightened adults, capable of weighing the evidence, supporting competing knowledge claims, and avoiding the dogmas of religion, patriotism, and other forms of indoctrination. This is from Irvine in 2001. Russell in 1950 goes further, claiming that an education that emphasizes an empiricist scientific method is consistent with, quote, the essence of the liberal outlook, end quote, because it too avoids dogmatic and fanatical belief systems. Indeed, since, quote, the only philosophy that affords a theoretical justification of democracy and that accords with democracy in a temper of mind is empiricism. An education that combines both empiricist and liberal perspectives would provide future citizens with the very framework needed to bring about a just and a peaceful world. However, Russell's account of the scientific method includes the a priori sciences of logic and mathematics as integral to his empiricism. For an account of the relationship between scientific philosophy and his educational thought, see Woodhouse's publication of 1985 and Winchester's publication of 2001. Chomsky, in 1987, agreed with Russell about the need to avoid indoctrination, a practice that he, too, finds predominant in state-run schools, where there is a period of regimentation and control, part of which involves direct indoctrination, providing a system of false beliefs. Quote, but more importantly, I think, is the manner and style of preventing and blocking independent and creative thinking, and imposing hierarchies and competitiveness, end quote. Schools engage not only in the inculcation of false beliefs, but the shifting of creative thought and the imposition of a hierarchical system in which competition with others is encouraged by means of the, quote, ranking of students, end quote. The very capacity for the creative use of language, which Chomsky believes is innate in human beings, is crushed by an emphasis on competition for success based on test results. It was only when he attended an elite high school that Chomsky experienced this kind of regimentation imposed by the grading system in which he nevertheless excelled. All of this, however, contrasts with Chomsky's earlier schooling, which he in 1987 described in quite different terms. I was sent to an experimental progressive school from infancy before I was 2 until about 12 years of age. It was essentially a Deweyite school, and I think a very good one. Judging from my experience, there was a tremendous premium on individual creativity, not in the sense of slapping paints on paper, but doing the kind of work and thinking you were interested in. So in the context of this, quote, lively atmosphere, Chomsky was able to engage in creative rule-bound thought, processes, and the kind of work that expressed his own interests. Even though Chomsky believes that, quote, schools could be run quite differently, end quote, there is a fundamental problem that any society based on authoritarian hierarchical institutions would not tolerate such a school system for very long. While a more democratic system might be tolerated for the elite as a place where they learn to think creatively, the mass of the population requires indoctrination to persuade them to accept their place in the oppressive economic and social structures of capitalism. This is why the roles that the public schools play in society could be very destructive. Now we get to the epistemology and education. And if you're not aware, epistemology is the theory of knowledge, how we obtain knowledge, what knowledge is, and how do we know it. What Chomsky writes about the dangers of schooling is familiar, however. When he considers the epistemological basis of an education that gives rise to creative thinking, he appears to part company from Russell. Chomsky in 2006 reemphasizes that the child's linguistic creativity, in which he very quickly knows the language as an act of normal intelligence, must be understood as stemming from the innate organizational principles of the human mind. As a result, he sees the need for discarding entirely behaviorism with its pseudo-scientific account of language development, and then he goes further, wishing to jettison the entire empiricist tradition from which it evolved. The rationalist tradition, spearheaded by Descartes, is far more conducive to the scientific method as he interprets it. And in particular, Chomsky in 2006 is attracted to the move of Descartes to the postulation of a second substance of mind, which he compares to Newton's postulation of action at a distance. For John Dewey, writing in 1966, quote, the value of recognizing the dynamic place of interest in an educative development is that it leads to considering individual children in their specific capabilities, needs, and preferences. End quote. Each scientist was engaged in a pursuit where they were moving into the domain of something that went beyond well-established science, and were trying to integrate it with well-established science by developing a theory in which these notions could be properly clarified and explained. The connection between the two, however, lies in their shared attempt to move beyond the scientific knowledge of the time and to show that the objects of their inquiry could be integrated with new theoretical frameworks. Even though Chomsky, in 2006, agrees that, quote, Descartes was unable to lay the groundworks for a mathematical theory of mind, as achieved by Newton and his followers, end quote. He believes the Cartesian goal of reaching, quote, a precisely articulated, clearly formulated abstract theory which will have empirical consequences, end quote, is worth pursuing. Chomsky clearly takes the issue with empiricism espoused by Russell, who, as we have seen, considers it the only philosophy that accords with democracy and its temper of mind. Nevertheless, Chomsky agrees that education should enable further citizens to look at the facts with an open mind, to put simple assumptions to the test, to pursue an argument to its conclusion. But he believes that this ability to follow a rational line of argument stems from Cartesian common sense, which is quite evidently distributed, and despite the indoctrination propagated by schools and the media, at least some citizens do exhibit a critical open-mindedness in their consideration of social and political issues. He attributes this awareness to Cartesian common sense rather to any special esoteric knowledge required to explore these depths which are non-existent. In other words, Chomsky believes in the capacity of ordinary citizens to understand how power operates in favor of the wealthy, even if they are unable to change the ways in which society currently operates. Chomsky then clarifies the concept of Cartesian common sense when he criticizes Russell's attempt to overcome the inadequacy of the empiricist approach to the acquisition of knowledge by proposing various principles of non-demonstrative inference. These principles were introduced by Russell in his latter philosophy in a way to strengthen both deduction and induction as reliable sources of scientific knowledge. I realize that all the inferences, both in common sense and in science, are of a different sort from those in deductive logic and are such that when the premises are true and the reasoning correct, the conclusion is only probable. Chomsky in 2006, however, is a skeptic towards this attempt to strengthen probability, arguing that even though the principles are added one by one to the principle of induction, they are inadequate. What is needed is a radically different approach, which is quite remote from empiricist presuppositions, one that furnishes the basis not only for scientific knowledge, but also for what we can call the constructions of common sense understanding, that is, for our ordinary notions concerning the nature of the physical and social world. A Cartesian approach to knowledge provides the basis for a common sense explanation of both the laws of nature and an understanding of the workings of society. Chomsky's emphasis on Cartesian common sense as a key notion in his epistemology allows him to trust in the judgment of ordinary people and their understanding of science and society. An education that furnishes the young with common sense and a healthy skepticism enables them to recognize injustices in the world. Despite their differences in their philosophical approach to knowledge, both Russell and Chomsky share a belief in the need to educate ordinary people about social and political affairs. Sperlich in 2006 believes that both men seek their task as established scientists who cannot be ignored, to find out the truth and tell the people about abuses of power which negate freedom and justice in language that can be readily understood. Their work as public intellectuals is an integral part of their humanistic approach to education. So, for Dewey, again, writing in 1966, quote, "The value of recognizing the dynamic place of interest in an educative development is that it leads to considering individual children in their specific capabilities, needs, and preferences." Foucault, in 2006, challenges Chomsky's reliance on Descartes, for whom the mind was not so very creative. Rather, he suggests that Leibniz is a better source, rather than Descartes. For he expresses the idea that in the profundity of the mind is incorporated a whole web of logical relations, which constitutes, in a certain sense, the not yet clarified and visible form of the reason itself. So I'm not really sure what Foucault is talking about there, but I've read Foucault, I've read Chomsky, I've read Russell. They're all brilliant thinkers, and like Woodhouse is saying, all of this needs to be taken into consideration. Now we're going to go into educational practice. We'll go into this educational practice. Okay. All right. Now, while it is beyond the scope of this article to consider in any depth Russell's Beacon Hill, an alternative school where he established with his second wife, Dora Black Russell, it is pertinent to his educational practice. Chomsky's practice in 2000, meanwhile, emerges primarily from his experience of schooling, some of which we encountered in the previous section, as well as from his commitment to educate for ordinary skepticism in his public lectures. In order to put some of their ideas into practice, Bertrand and Dora founded Beacon Hill School in 1927, which they established initially as a place fit for the education of their children, John and Kate. Several years before the opening of the school, they co-authored Prospects of Industrial Civilization, in which they expressed their hopes for education that would encourage free thinking among the young and avoid the carnage of the First World War. The Russells, in 1923, reiterate the familiar metaphor characterizing the humanistic approach to child-rearing introduced by Rousseau. Quote, "The humanistic conception regards the child as a gardener regards a young tree, i.e. as something with a certain intrinsic nature, which will develop into an admirable form, given proper soil, air, and light. The proper soil, air, and light necessary for the child's constructive growth require an atmosphere in which their intrinsic capabilities can be integrated into a cohesive whole by an open educational process. The atmosphere for enabling the child to grow constructively is far subtler than finding the right soil and the right light for a young tree. Educators must maintain a reverential attitude towards the human sapling, so their potential can be realized. Otherwise, the child will bend in directions determined by others, just as a tree bends in the way the wind blows, thwarting the organic principle of growth and denying their search for the nourishment of a free environment." Russell in 1980 in particular believes free movement and expression should be matched by an inner freedom that enables the use of the child's own imagination to find its own way. The delicate balance between the inner and outer impulses for freedom can best be achieved in a school where each child is free to come into classrooms and work and learn, or not to do so, and to work in his own time at his own pace. Dora then advocates greater freedom for children, capable of deciding whether to engage in the creative arts that strengthen their imagination, pursue subjects like history and science that enhance their intellectual growth, or simply play. And we see the works of Jean Piaget on play, imagination, and dreams and childhood experiences. Like A.S. Neil's Summerhill, students at Beacon Hill were not required to attend classes, though if they disturbed others, they were asked to leave and occupy themselves outdoors or in the playroom. Sperlich, in 2006, believes that Chomsky's Deweyite primary schooling in many ways was the type of libertarian Beacon Hill school that Russell had set up in England. Both schools emphasized the freedom of inquiry in which children engaged their interest by working individually or in a group. This appealed to the young Chomsky in 1987 because there was a feeling, quote, that everybody was doing something important, end quote. From an early age, his parents acquainted him with Hebrew language and literature, and by the time he entered high school, he learned about anarcho-syndicalism from his uncle, who introduced him to a lively group of European immigrants. Indeed, he described, quote, the Jewish working class culture in New York as the most influential intellectual culture during my early teens. What Chomsky learned from this experience was the importance of self-education, since many of the intellectuals he met were autodidacts who had learned about anarcho-syndicalism through their own reading and discussion with others. Another way in which Chomsky puts his educational ideas into practice is through the many public lectures he gives on American domestic and foreign policy. His opposition to the Vietnam War during the 1960s marked the beginning of this activity, and it meant speaking several nights a week at a church to an audience of half a dozen people, and eventually meant participation in demonstrations, lobbying, organization resistance, civil disobedience and arrests, endless speaking and travel, and the expected concomitants, threats of a fairly serious nature. Although his ongoing commitment to exposing any system based on lying and deceit has at times taken him away from important work in linguistics, there are numerous compensations and accomplishments that give much satisfaction, however small they may be, including the people he has met, as well as the aspects of life that he would not otherwise have experienced. Chomsky's approach in 2006 to this form of public education is that of a scientist who has a responsibility to show how a propaganda system attempts to fix the limits of possible thought and deny independence of judgment. His activism is consistent with that of Russell, who was imprisoned for 6 months for his vocal opposition to the First World War. and for 1 week when he was 89 years old for incitement to civil disobedience in support of the campaign for nuclear disarmament. And this was written by A.J. Ayer from Oxford in 1982. So here we see that as Bertrand Russell was in opposition to the World War, Chomsky was in opposition to the Vietnam War. According to Ayer, in A.J. Ayer in 1982, Russell's epistemological stance was quite different. Quote, if the attitude of common sense is represented by naive realism, the theory that we directly perceive physical objects much as they really are, then Russell's opinion of common sense was that it conflicted with science, and in such a context he thought science ought to be given the verdict. As mentioned, Chomsky rejects B.F. Skinner's behaviorism, whose, quote, claims dissolve until triviality or incoherence under analysis, end quote. In his latter educational philosophy, however, Bertrand Russell in 1927 believed that behaviorism is, quote, the only valid method for the study of animal and child psychology, end quote. And so he differs from Chomsky on this. Among the many often conflicting accounts are those of Dora herself. In 1980, Hemmings in 73, and Tate in 75, Brunel in 2003, Gorham in 2005. In 1931, Russell believed the schools to be a success. Quote, it was an experiment on my part. I wrote a book on education and I wanted to try out my own theories. To surprise the theories that have worked out well, cited in Hemmings in 1973. Latter, however, Russell in 1960 changed his mind. For various reasons unconnected with educational theory, he did not think that Beacon Hill was a success. Among the unstated reasons were the number of problem children the Russells accepted at the school and the favoritism he and Doris showed towards their own children. So here we see that he thought it wasn't a success because they had probably children with behaviors that they couldn't control, and then they probably had to show the favoritism to their own children as opposed to the other children that they were educating as well. And so Rousseau anticipates Russell's concept of reverence. He says that, quote, hold childhood in reverence and do not be in any hurry to judge it for good or ill, end quote. A major difference with Neil's Summerhill School was that he placed more emphasis on handwork in his school, while the Russells seemed more interested in thought and ideas. So once they're expressing children's thoughts and ideas and how they develop their thought about things. And then the other school is more about hands-on activities and learning to explore with your hands. And so, nevertheless, Summerhill, like Summerhill, Beacon Hill had a council which was the true essence of the school, which allowed discussion and agreement between the children and grown-ups, and who were empowered to discuss anything. So that's really good. They had a council where the students and the teachers were able to discuss anything, and so that's good. So here we go under educational implications for the present day. The questions raised by Russell and Chomsky are of concern not only to philosophers in the tradition of humanistic education, but also to the practice of schools and universities today. The concept of growth at the core of Russell's educational philosophy, for example, is not unlike that of John Dewey, who wrote earlier that, quote, since in reality there is nothing to which growth is relative save more growth, there is nothing to which education is subordinate save more education, end quote. I like that quote. Similarly, Whitehead in 1957 considers the process of learning as proceeding through periods of mental growth with their cyclic recurrences, yet always different as we pass from cycle to cycle. Meanwhile, Gorham in 2005 believes that Beacon Hill School deserves a place in the history of the progressive educational movement, not least because it anticipates the concept of the hidden curriculum articulated in Illich's Deschooling Society. Quote, paradoxically, Dora Russell's Beacon Hill, just because it was a failure as an institution, it was small, unstable, and precarious for much of its history, may have succeeded as a deschooled school. I'm not sure what he means by that, but Chomsky's contributions have been no less significant. Ross, in 2014, argues that his theory of language as the function of a universal generative grammar made possible by the creative organizational principles of the human mind sparked a paradigmatic revolution in the field of linguistics. This has enabled Chomsky in 2006 to engage constructively in discussions of the philosophy of language proposed by Quine, W.V. Quine, Nelson Goodman, and others. Human creativity at the core of Chomsky's humanistic education was stimulated by his early childhood education, which he finds actively suppressed in the hierarchical school system. McMurtry in 1988 agreed with Chomsky that schools are authoritarian institutions, where there is no right of appeal to authority of evidence, argument to what may or may not be taught. So that's a good point. The matter is decided by authorities external to the subject discipline itself, and they normally caution against or rule out whatever might be perceived as a challenge to prevailing opinion and power. The ultimate authority for what is taught lies in the subject matter and the methods of inquiry that constitute knowledge, as well as the evidence and argument justifying them. Where external authority, whether government, dictate, or other powerful forces override these established normalities, the result is indoctrination rather than education for critical thought. McMurtry in 1988 argued further that, quote, the educational system, in short, should be governed by its own disciplines of research and expression, not by special interests and demands, or it is not education. And so I'm gonna quote that again. The education system, in short should be, he says, governed by its own disciplines of research and expression, not by special interests and demands. If it is so, it is not education. This, in turn, relates to the meaning of education, which, as mentioned above, is to enable the growth of a, quote, more inclusive range of thought, experience, and action. Schools, however, are becoming anti-educational, not only as a result of greater competition for grades as decried by Chomsky, but as Westheimer in 2014 points out, by, quote, the relentless focus on testing and achievement, which means that time for in-depth critical analysis of ideas has been diminished. Standardized tests consist of pre-packaged questions to be answered by students, whose thought process is determined by companies that manufacture tests for private profit. Learning is reduced to a programmed hierarchy of assembled line questions, the answers to which are determined by prescribed outcomes. Learning then becomes a mechanistic ritual rather than an organic process freely engaged in to maximize the range of understanding. Students are required to acquire the skills and competencies necessary for the workplace. This is Rutenberg in 2019. Instead of promoting a process of inquiry, teachers pass on inert material over which they have no control, being forced to comply with the demands of externally imposed standards of evaluation. As Collins points out in 1998, the pressures on teachers from government agencies to ensure that their students are winners in the race for grades has meant that the de-skilling of teachers occurs as the curriculum becomes more standardized and as their work time is more strictly arranged to meet the bureaucratically conceived specifications of what education should be about. The result is attack on teacher autonomy by an overarching regime whose anti-educational directives are imposed from above. This is precisely why Russell and Chomsky are opposed to the mechanistic conception of education that defines the teacher's role as that of filling empty vessels with isolated bits of information. Russell and Chomsky's respective views thus necessitate a robust commitment to academic freedom for K-12 teachers. The subjugation of critical reason is not confined to schools, however. Universities are, in Chomsky's words, committed to the needs of the powers that dominate these institutions, primarily the government, the major corporations, and so on. The goal of education to advance and disseminate shared knowledge is undermined by the opposing goal of the corporate market to maximize private monetary profits. This is Woodhouse in 2009. Russell in 2006 understood this tendency as early as the 1930s when he wrote of the code of efficiency that measures everything in terms of money and the speed with goods can be produced. Quote, the contemplative habit of mind necessary for understanding the world in a dispassionate way becomes redundant, as knowledge is no longer considered as valuable in itself, but only as an instrument for increased power over others. As a result, academic freedom, which is a necessary condition for the advancement of knowledge, is threatened. since research and teaching are increasingly conducted in ways that enhance private wealth. Woodhouse, 2019. Russell, in 1983, himself originally considered the question of the value of academic freedom in 1940, when he said, in a world distracted by war, tormented by persecution, and abandoned in concentration camps, he said he immediately answered that it is part and parcel of the same battle. The reason he gave was the following: let it be remembered that what is at stake in the greatest issues, as well as in those that seem smaller, is the freedom of the individual human spirit to express its beliefs and hopes for mankind, whether they be shared by many or by few or by none. For comparative analysis of Bertrand Russell, John Dewey, and Alfred North Whitehead's conceptualizations of growth, see Woodhouse's publication in 1983. For further analysis, see his publication in 2006. Academic freedom, then, is crucial to the ability of human beings to express their beliefs, however unpopular or heretical they may be to those in power. As part of the free expression of the human spirit, it is necessary for building a better world. And Russell in 1950 was clear that teachers should have the same kind of freedom to express their views as their university counterparts. Quote, there ought to be a great deal more freedom than there is for the scholastic profession. It ought to have more opportunities of self-determination, more independence from the interference of bureaucrats and bigots. End quote. Unless teachers have greater independence from external authority to determine what and how to teach, they will be unable to instill in the young the habit of impartial inquiry, on which critical thinking and the scientific method depend. Nor is this a utopian idea. Clark in 2001 argues, there is no logical reason why academic freedom should be limited to university teachers simply because they engage in scholarship and research. After all, public school teachers can still encourage their students to pursue knowledge and truth by stoking the fire of critical and creative thinking, which stimulates and challenges students. Education at any level involves moving learners beyond their present epistemological boundaries, enlivening critical thinking among them. It could, however, be argued that creative teachers are able to cultivate this capacity without the protection of academic freedom. Where teachers manage to achieve this, their efforts are often supported by school administrators, committed to the same educational goal. Hare, in 1990, however, argues that this situation should not just be an occasional privilege accorded by thoughtful administrators. He claims that teachers should have the right to such freedom. The common assumption is that academic freedom has application only in the university system. But if an open forum of discussion is appropriate at any level, then progressively there must be an anticipation of the practice during earlier stages of education. A rigid division between different levels is arbitrary. He refers to this mistaken belief as the fallacy of the magic transition. As long as it continues to hold sway, schools will fail to provide students with the kind of open discussion of the marketplace of ideas that defines education. Hare believes that Russell would object to this fallacious reasoning as anti-educational. Nevertheless, it might be objected that teachers should not enjoy the full scope of autonomy granted to university faculty because they need guidelines from government in terms of curriculum and pedagogical methods. The objection presupposes the very point at issue, namely that the intervention of external authority can be used to override the subject matter and methods of inquiry that constitute the core of education. For the sake of argument, however, let us suppose that this kind of intervention can, in principle, be justified. For example, if a teacher were systematically denying all the evidence that the Holocaust took place and encouraged anti-Semitic attitudes, resulting in derogatory comments about Jews by students in their written work, interestingly, as Hare points out, this is precisely what actually happened in the case of Alberta teacher Jim Keegstra in the 1980s. Maxwell in 2018 proposes 4 principles defining free speech in the classroom: curricular alignment, even-handedness, avoiding inflammatory speech, and age-appropriateness as relatively common sense set of criteria that can be referred to when there's a disagreement about the teaching of controversial issues. And yet again, he's talking about curricular alignment, even-handedness, avoiding inflammatory speech, and age-appropriateness when there's disagreement about the teaching of controversial issues in classrooms. Yet a closer examination reveals that the Keegstra example actually violates the limits of academic freedom. There are 2 necessary conditions for a knowledge claim to be protected by academic freedom. whether in teaching or research. First, that one engages in a critical examination of the evidence supporting it, and second, that one respect the right of those who hold opposing views to do so. This is what Woodhouse says in 2017. In terms of the conditions necessary for any knowledge claim to be protected by academic freedom, Keegstra fails on both counts. First, he refuses to consider the overwhelming amount of counter-evidence to his claim that the Holocaust did not take place, insisting that it was further proof of a Jewish conspiracy. Nor did he respect the right of his students to hold opposing views by entering into a dialogue with them. Rather, he misused his authority by giving poor grades to any written work that ran counter to his own preconceived notions. One can safely infer that for these reasons, Keegstra was engaged in indoctrination, not education. Nevertheless, Hare concludes that, quote, it would be a pity if confusion resulting from the Keegstra case gave undeserved support to the idea that teachers must remain neutral on controversial issues, end quote. That's a good point. Neutrality stifles debate and contravenes one of the main aims of education, the development of the capacity for rational understanding. As Hare puts it, if it is true now that people are not particularly good at distinguishing truth from falsity, it is especially important for schools to look for ways in which this ability can be developed. If, and only if, schools enable students to examine the evidence supporting any knowledge claim, can they perform a major function of education, which, as Russell puts it, is to instill in the young the habit of impartial inquiry. Neutrality on the part of teachers can hinder student engagement in discussing ethical views about which there is considerable disagreement. It is far preferable, argues Russell, that students make up their own minds by being exposed to a variety of teachers with strong opinions and the most vehement and terrific argumentation on all sides of every question. In conclusion, it can be seen that Bertrand Russell agrees with Noam Chomsky, that all those who enjoy the right to academic freedom have a responsibility as intellectuals to speak the truth and to expose lies. This, it seems to me, is the bedrock for the humanistic approach to education espoused by both philosophers. And there you have it. Russell and Chomsky as advocates of humanistic education. And I'll say that one more time, just to make it clear, that all those who enjoy the right to academic freedom have a responsibility as intellectuals to speak the truth and to expose the lies. Thank you.